Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting off in about 20 seconds. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Maturity Model for Public Participation. My name is Robin Prest at Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue here in Vancouver, Canada, and on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples. As is our protocol here at the Centre for Dialogue, we like to acknowledge the territory that we're on, and especially as we enter a webinar talking about public participation, I'm thinking in particular about both the importance of engaging Indigenous peoples, but also the distinctions as far as engaging rights holders and the government-to-government relationship that exists with Indigenous peoples here in Canada, as opposed to general public participation. I've also been thinking a lot about democracy recently and have been inspired by some of the learnings that have been shared with me around intergenerational decision-making and how those Indigenous principles are so important as we consider whose voices are heard as we make decisions. As you may know, the maturity model for public participation is a tool that helps us to define what high-quality public participation looks like, and just as importantly, supports governments to develop their capacity to deliver that work. So a really exciting topic for me. And this is one of the tools that I'm most excited to launch probably in the last 5 years, based on the process and the response that we've received so far as we've developed it. I am really curious who's here. We had over 300 people register for the webinar, and we want to take just a moment to understand who you are through 2 polls. So the first poll that we're going to launch is, where are you joining us from? Are you here on the west side of Canada, British Columbia and Yukon, from Nunavut in the Northwest Territories, from the Prairie Provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, or internationally? It's always difficult to decide on groupings for these questions, but hopefully you can find yourself in one of those different locations. And the second poll question you'll see is, we're asking you, who do you work mostly with? And you can select multiple options, but do you work mostly with local governments, with provincial territorial governments, our federal or national government in Canada, Indigenous governments, or governments outside of Canada? And we also have an other box in case that doesn't capture your experience. So we'll wait until folks have had a chance to key in their answers. Maybe we'll give you about 10 more seconds to answer there, and then we'll see what the results are. All right, so take about 2 more seconds to find your answers. And then maybe I'll ask Sabrina, our tech host, if she can show us the results once those are in. Okay, and it looks like we have a large volume of international participants. About a quarter of us are from international. About half of us are from British Columbia and the Yukon Territory, that of course being the place where the Centre for Dialogue is based, here in Vancouver, British Columbia, and then folks joining from across Canada as well. And then as far as governments that folks work with, lots of folks working with local governments, also territorial, federal, some Indigenous governments, and some governments outside of Canada. So a real spread. I think that we'll have something of interest to just about all of you, and you can let us know as we proceed. All right, so a little bit about why I said a moment ago this is such an exciting launch for me. It was 2 years ago that we started to conceive of the maturity model and public participation. And that's been a long participatory journey to get here. It involves a partnership and collaboration with the Government of Canada, and then also co-creation activities across many folks within Canada, many thought leaders within Canada, as well as a peer review internationally. And for a tool that hasn't been actually launched yet, I've been just blown away by the amount of organic interest it started to generate. Our agenda for today: first, we're going to have a presentation by the lead author of the maturity model, Nicole Armos, who is our Associate Director for our Office of Knowledge and Practice. We will then have a fireside chat, and we're really lucky to have 3 special guests joining us for that fireside chat, including our own Aftab Erfan from the Centre for Dialogue, Tim Hughes from the Open Government Partnership, and Charles Taillefer from the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat in the Government of Canada. So that'll take us through to the first 60 minutes of the webinar. And then in the last 30 minutes of this 90-minute webinar, we're going to dive into your questions and have a chance for some Q&A. Okay, so I now have the great pleasure to introduce Nicole Armos, as I said, the lead author of our maturity model on public participation. Nicole's also the author of our Beyond Inclusion Guide, which is one of our most popular and most effective resources that we've developed at the Centre for Dialogue. And Nicole is currently co-facilitating the City of New Westminster's Community Advisory Committee, which is a really innovative combination of deliberative mini-publics, replacing some of the functions of advisory committees in municipalities. So Nicole, looking forward to your presentation, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Robin. I'm just going to set up my slides here. And thank you to everybody who's joining us from, it's exciting to see folks from all around the world, as well as across Canada, for this much anticipated launch of our maturity model. And I noticed today is actually the International Day of Democracy. So it's a really wonderful moment to celebrate a lot of folks who have collaborated in creating this resource and bringing a new vision to what democratic participation can be. I wanted to start off today by sharing the background of why and how we made this tool. As many of you have likely seen in the last few years, there is a growing recognition in Canada and around the world of the value of involving diverse members of the public in the development of effective and sustainable policies, plans, and programs. Public participation has also been identified by the OECD as a key driver of trust in government, far outpacing partisanship, education, finances, gender, or age. At a time when democracies around the world are being challenged, high-quality public participation offers an opportunity to increase civic engagement, address misinformation, and reinforce democratic values. However, we're noticing that approaches to public participation are still highly inconsistent across government departments and institutions. We're seeing different levels of understanding and support from leadership, varying levels of staff and resources dedicated to engagement activities, and inconsistent policies and structures, which ultimately translate into very different levels of quality or types of experience in engagement processes. This inconsistency is being reflected back by the public. The OECD's trust surveys have found that in Canada, only 40% of Canadians feel they have a say in what government does, and only 40% feel the government is responsive to public input they receive in a public consultation. And these numbers are close to the average OECD country as well. Poor quality engagement can cause more harm than good, weakening public trust in government or generating misleading data that doesn't represent the public interest when it doesn't fully include everyone's voices. Especially at a time of limited public resources and public service, we want to be making sure that any investments in public participation are deployed strategically, generate useful input for decision makers, while providing an accessible, transparent, and positive experience for members of the public. So we started to ask ourselves, what does quality public participation look like, and what equips governments and organizations to consistently implement good practices? The maturity model aims to respond to this with a set of 2 developmental tools that help to assess and enhance organizational capacity and specific engagement practices in order to uphold and advance core principles of public participation. So I'm going to dive right into what these tools look like. And for today's presentation, I actually wanted to start with Tool B, the assessment matrix for public participation, which aims to establish core benchmarks of effective engagement practices on the ground. Our work here began with a comparative analysis of core principles of public participation reflected by leading organizations such as the International Association for Public Participation, the OECD, the UN, the Government of Canada's Public Engagement Community of Practice, and others. Despite differences in wording, framing, and level of detail, there was a nearly unanimous convergence around 5 core ideas. Accountability, so the degree to which the government or sponsor actually uses a public input to inform decision-making, transparency around process and outcomes, equitable inclusion of the full diversity of the people who are most impacted, informed participation grounded in evidence-based information, and responsive design that aligns with objectives, resources, and needs. While the specific practices to enact these principles are highly context dependent, and you can't have a really universal one-size-fits-all approach to engagement, principles do need to be grounded in concrete actions to avoid becoming empty rhetoric. So to generate core benchmarks, we hosted workshops with leading practitioners from across the country, asking them to describe what should be the minimum specs, as well as the aspirational practices for each principle, drawing examples from their practice. Input from these workshops, as well as a literature review of guidelines for public participation and feedback from 11 other external reviewers, helped us to map engagement practices along a continuum, depending on the likelihood with which they would uphold core principles. The assessment matrix maps engagement practices across 4 levels of maturity. At the first level, we see that effective engagement practices may happen in an informal or ad hoc manner, depending on the knowledge, initiative, or capacity of individual staff. At the second level, specific guidelines, processes, and standards are articulated and applied consistently across projects. Under ideal and fairly uniform conditions, it is more likely that core principles are met in the engagement. At the third level, tailored plans are developed to uphold principles in the unique context of each engagement initiative, and there are mechanisms in place to monitor progress and adjust approaches in response to changing circumstances. Lastly, at the fourth level, engagement projects demonstrate innovation and creativity in enacting principles, and organizers share project lessons to help advance the field. We recommend that organizations aim for practices at level 3 or higher, especially in high-profile projects or when engaging historically underrepresented communities, where it is more critical to demonstrate trustworthiness and foster good relationships with the community. Meanwhile, engagement practices at level 4 deepen the impact of initiatives and help to advance the field. Using these definitions, we have developed a distinct ladder for each of the 5 core principles of public participation, further breaking these down into particular indicators. So for instance, when we're assessing informed participation, there are separate tracks to assess how much information is provided to the public, as well as how information is curated to ensure it is evidence-based and reflective of diverse perspectives. Now, this tool is designed to assess action on the ground, so I wanted us to explore what it would feel like with a couple of polls that I'll just pull up on my side in a minute. There we go. So the first question, there's going to be 2 questions here. The first question is going to ask you to think about the last public participation process you were involved in, whether as a participant or as an organizer, and which statement best describes how results were reported back. One is that the government publicly shared back how public input shaped actions and decisions. Option B, there was a public what we heard report. Option C, there was a high-level summary that was circulated just amongst participants or stakeholders. And option D, there was no report back. And you'll see that question number 2 is asking, thinking of the same example, what did inclusion of diverse participants look like? Was everyone just invited to take part through the outreach process? Was there mapping of particular impacted communities to develop dedicated outreach strategies? Was there monitoring of participation and a way to address those gaps? Or were there proactive strategies to enhance proportional representation, such as using a civic lottery or parallel engagement streams? I'll just give us a minute to watch those results come in. Okay, so I'm going to share the results on our end. So we can see with the first question, which is about essentially transparency of the outcomes of an engagement process, we can see that the What We Heard report is becoming more popular. About 40% of us have seen those. But there is still about 40% of instances where either a high-level summary was just circulated amongst participants, and so not really available for the broader public, or there was no report back at all in 1/5 of the processes that we've been involved in. This is really reflective of what I've seen in different places where I've run this poll. And this is the kind of inconsistency that we were describing in the beginning, where the public may not know what to expect when they are entering a public engagement process. They might not have the confidence that they're going to be able to see the results of their participation afterwards. Similarly, in the inclusion question we have here, the more common approach by far, 65%, is we're just opening it up and inviting everyone to participate, which is really great, but it doesn't really take into account the equity considerations where different folks may have different access to information from government streams or may have different ways of becoming involved. I am glad to see that there's more and more mapping of impacted communities and developing a more tailored outreach process. But we are still seeing very little in the more proactive, the kind of 2 higher levels of approaches to equitable inclusion, such as really monitoring participation through registration processes or using some kind of proactive strategy that really enhances participation. And as you can see with those 2 polls, not just the difference of experiences that the public may have in different engagement processes, but also that the same project might have a stronger or weaker engagement practice in relation to different principles or indicators. And I actually think it's quite likely that as folks use these tools that we've developed in the maturity model, they will find they identify with characteristics at different levels across different areas. You might be really strong at transparency. You might be a little bit weaker in your inclusion practices. You might be really great at curating information, but maybe not as great at having integrated strategies to make sure that input is reaching the decision-making process. And so we've designed this to be a flexible assessment tool where it's, instead of kind of narrowing it down to a final score and saying you're overall a level 2 or a level 3, this is really about mapping your organization's unique profile of strengths and weaknesses in order to create a customized roadmap for enhancement. The maturity models tools can in fact be used for various purposes. Tool B, which is what we were just looking at, can be used to assess either your standard kind of average engagement approach. You can use it to evaluate a past project across some standard benchmarks, or you can use it to scope potential projects and determine if you have the appropriate conditions to proceed in a good way, in a way that meets your target engagement practices. And as we were developing this assessment matrix, we realized that there were factors that go beyond engagement practices on the ground. There are also various organizational factors that enable or limit whether effective engagement practices can be implemented consistently. And for this reason, we also developed Tool A to help assess organizational capacity for public participation. Tool A describes common characteristics, structures, and resources of organizations at 4 levels of maturity in relation to their capacity for conducting public participation. At level 1, we see organizations where engagement activities are periodically used to invite broad public feedback. There is starting to be kind of a 2-way engagement with the public. But engagement questions may or may not be aligned with active decision-making windows, and the organization primarily relies on existing staff capacity and resources, and maybe existing communication platforms to carry out their engagement initiatives. This means that the quality of engagement initiatives can be hit or miss, often depending on the skills of the staff involved, or how challenging the topic is, or other external circumstances. At level 2, organizations have a more consistent pattern of engaging the public. A public participation strategy or framework is in place to provide guidance on how to decide when to engage, define the level of influence public input will have, and articulate minimum standards of engagement. Organizers hold a baseline level of skills and knowledge to deliver engagement initiatives, or are able to contract engagement specialists as needed. While engagement at this level is more consistent, if it isn't met with endorsement from senior leadership, alignment with decision-making timelines, or transparency around outcomes, the public may lose confidence that their input is being meaningfully considered. It can sometimes come across as engagement for the sake of engagement. Also, while establishing standard practices for engagement can safeguard quality, they can also limit the flexibility needed to respond to diverse contexts or unexpected circumstances. So at level 3, we start to see that flexibility as well as more strategic alignment between the engagement opportunities and key stages of decision-making. Dedicated resources are supplemented with project-based funding as needed, and organizers have greater fluency in engagement practices, which allows them to tailor methods to the needs of decision makers and the public. There are also organizational structures and policies that enable effective engagement practices, such as customer relation management platforms, honoraria policies, or standing offers for contracting engagement specialists. Tailored engagement initiatives lead to higher quality outcomes. However, sometimes we see that these operate as standalone projects, like one particular project will be operating at this level, and it also can limit the opportunity to share findings with system-wide decision makers or to foster long-term relationships with communities. Finally, at level 4, organizations demonstrate a deep commitment to fostering a culture of participation, both within and outside of their organization. They invite collaboration throughout decision-making processes, including when naming and framing issues and trade-offs, designing engagement processes, developing solutions, and implementing outcomes. Organizational leaders champion public participation, and public participation offices are positioned at a senior level where they have direct reporting relationships to executive decision makers, as well as horizontal influence across the organization. Organizers are able to innovate with engagement methods and share experiences to help advance the field. However, we do recognize that fostering a culture of participation requires organizational culture shift at all levels of the organization and a greater investment of time and resources to support public participation initiatives. So for this reason, we do still recommend that level 3 is kind of a good gold standard, but that if you do have additional resources and ability to invest, level 4 really does enhance your impact and helps to advance the field. I also wanted to mention here that the maturity model, I know I'm speaking about levels, and even the word maturity sometimes can suggest a value judgment to organizations who are operating in different levels. I like to think of the word maturity in the sense of ripeness. Public engagement is fundamentally a relationship between an organization and the community it serves. And just like an unripe fruit holds all the potential of its future sweetness, when an organization's capacity for public participation is at a lower level of maturity, its relationship with the public holds untapped potential. Developing our engagement capacity means thinking about the structures, resources, and processes that help us access and manifest that potential through meaningful and effective engagement practices. Now, the full tool that's available online, I believe we have the link in the chat. It also offers additional resources to support organizations who are seeking to assess and really go on this journey to enhance their impact. Each of the pages of the organizational tool, the tool A, includes a description of the profile as I was describing, as well as opportunities for growth that includes suggested resources and action steps that can help to enhance organizational capacity. We also have included planning templates where you can map your strengths and weaknesses and develop a specific action plan for enhancing your public participation capacity or practices. And I really encourage people to get hands-on with this tool, print out copies for different staff, engage in discussion, and come up with next steps that are realistic and priorities for your particular context. In addition to the English version, we also have the maturity model available in French and Spanish on our website. I believe the Spanish version will be coming online very shortly and will be included in the email to registrants of this webinar. And the last thing I wanted to note today is that we are also still learning, and the maturity model itself is going to be maturing over time. So the framework we've created is being published as a beta version because even though it emerged from this extensive process of research and conversation with leading engagement practitioners, we do believe that a fuller understanding, especially of the organizational levers for change, can only emerge from piloting this tool in diverse contexts. So we're hoping that we could invite you to join us on that journey, and we invite you to share your feedback through a survey on our website to contribute to the ongoing evolution of this tool. And with that, I will stop my share and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And to assist us with the next part of this conversation, let me welcome up one at a time our special guests. Again, Dr. Aftab Erfan is the Executive Director of SFU's Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue, where I work. She also is an associate member of the SFU School of Public Policy, and previously was the City of Vancouver's Chief Equity Officer, the first person to hold that title at a city across Canada. Aftab has also been instrumental, among others, in spreading Lewis deep democracy methods to Canada from South Africa. And I've learned a lot from Aftab about facilitating in conflict situations and mediating conflict. So thanks so much for joining us, Aftab.
Pleasure. So nice to be here and with so many people.
All right. Next, we have Tim Hughes. Tim is a global expert in public participation and democratic innovation. He's currently a champion for this work at the Open Government Partnership, where he works, including efforts to mainstream public participation in governments. Tim previously led Involve UK, and we're grateful that Tim is able to join us today, only a few weeks before the Open Government Partnership's Global Summit in Spain. So thanks so much for joining us during this busy time, Tim.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Robin.
All right, last but not least, we have Charles Taillefer. Charles is a senior executive with the Government of Canada who has demonstrated leadership and advanced innovation across a number of policy domains, including open government, transparency, accountability, trans-border data flows, privacy practices, information security, and regulating artificial intelligence and data. Charles is somebody I've learned a lot from about how government works in his role as the co-chair of Canada's Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Open Government. And Charles, really pleased to have you here.
It's great to be here. I'm glad you said how government works.
All right.
Sometimes people think it doesn't.
There you go. Well, it's the dedication of people that does make it work. So thanks so much for joining us, Charles. And a couple of ground rules just as we launch in. A reminder that we're going to ask everybody to keep their answers down to a minute or two as we work through the conversation. We'll keep it flowing. That said, please feel free to interject. If somebody says something and you want to do a hot response, please just come off mute and enter the conversation so that we can have a bit of a free flow. My first question is for everyone, but starting with Aftab. And this question maybe is a little bit spicy, or is a recognition that for those of us who work in this space, we hear constantly from decision makers that they want to hear from people. I think it's almost a trope, or a little bit of something that we hear constantly, but maybe has even lost its meaning over time. As we hear decision makers say, we want to hear from the public. And yet there's this huge gap between that stated intention and what we see in practice. Not in all circumstances, certainly, but in many circumstances. And I would say that this isn't a Canadian phenomenon, this is an international phenomenon. So it's more than just about intentions. So Aftab, can you help us just understand a little bit more? What are some of the gaps that you're seeing when public participation hits the road? And why do you think those gaps still exist?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it in 2 minutes or less, I think you said. I mean, I think there's many different ways to go with this, and maybe I'll start with what I think is almost like a conceptual or philosophical gap of sorts, which is that I think we do hear from elected officials, we want to hear from the public, but there is the basic assumption, I think, both within government and actually within society largely, is that representative democracy, the fact that we go to the polls and elect officials, that actually is the way that we make decisions. And I feel like that has never that stands strong, and we're even hearing a little bit of, I mean, especially as we think about how do we engage with the public that actually is representative or looks more like the actual community in a civic lottery or something like that. I think we are getting some pushback because there's the feeling of the representatives are actually the folks who were elected. And so we're kind of defaulting to representative democracy. And we are in a moment that where representative democracy itself is under threat. And so I'm seeing a little bit of like actually like doubling down on representative democracy, the responsibility of politicians to make hard decisions. And so I think energetically there isn't a lot of energy available for these more direct forms or participatory forms of democracy. And it's become harder to do because there's so little trust in governments on the parts of the public. So those are some of the forces that I see at play.
So interesting. Thank you, Aftab. Tim, can I ask you to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my answer kind of really builds on what Aftab was saying, because I think although, as you say, I think there's a general sense from many politicians, policymakers, that public participation is a good thing. I think it still, for many, sits on the periphery of what we understand as democracy or what we understand as good policy making. And it's not really been properly embedded into, I often talk around kind of mental models in this, particularly when we're thinking about systems change. Like fundamental to any systems change is changing the way that we think about kind of actually what good looks like, what kind of how the system should operate. And currently, I think participation is often seen as a nice to have or a kind of a supplementary activity in democracy and policy making, rather than actually kind of being truly fundamental to it. And then I think a lot of the other issues kind of then flow out from that. So whether it be a lack of the right resources, the lack of the right skills, policies and kind of processes not fitting with participation, I think a lot of it stems from the fact that it still too often sits on the edges of policy making, rather than actually being fundamentally kind of embedded within the way that we think about how government should work, how democracy should work.
Thanks so much for that, Tim. Charles, can I go to you next?
Yeah, sure. I do think that public engagement has to be looked at in the context, certainly in the government context, in terms of accountability. And I think that's where, when we look at who is ultimately accountable, you have your elected officials that are ultimately accountable. So that tends to drive the focus of certainly the policies that advance, but also the way we look at policy development. Having said that, there is a big gap between ultimate decision making and the way that policies are advanced and options that are looked at. And this is where I think we've been hearing from people the realities of it is that people want to be involved in decisions that directly impact them, and that when they are involved, trust in government goes up, and that's noted in the document quite clearly. I think what also happens is that in government, traditionally, putting out information for comment, I would call it a passive form of engagement, has been something that has been around for a while. It's seen as something that works, but the demand from the public with more engagement in through social media and other forms, that type of engagement no longer responds to the public's expectations. And I think it is incumbent on governments to look at how they can better meet the public's expectations in terms of that level of engagement.
Thanks, Charles. And Nicole, how would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, I might piggyback a little bit on what Charles is saying. I think a lot about the aspect of transparency and how closely tied that is to accountability. I thought it was really fascinating to see the OECD's data in terms of people not believing that their public input is actually being used, even when they are being engaged. And someone who used to be very deeply involved in the reporting of public engagement initiatives, I remember having a participant tell me, how are you going to make this shelf-proof? How is this not just going to sit somewhere and not be looked at? And so I think that there's things that we need to look at in the policymaking process in terms of at what points are we integrating that to make sure there's impact. But there's also this aspect of reporting back to the public in a really transparent way. We're seeing more and more innovative methods of giving folks a very granular explanation of when their recommendations, for instance, have been accepted, why they haven't been accepted, how maybe recommendations have been modified for different contexts. And so I think the more that we start to consider the full life cycle of that relationship with the public, starting from how do we involve them in naming and framing the issues that are on the table, but also in how do we keep them involved in seeing the impact of their work, that will also enhance the trust that is necessary to then have them participate more often.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. And we've been reflecting on what does high quality participation look like from a participant's perspective, and why does that not happen? Maybe we can shift the conversation a little bit now to talk about what it's like to be inside a government organizational structure and what's necessary in order to shift that structure so that it has the intentions and the capacities to do this work in a good way. Charles, in particular, the Government of Canada has been a really important partner and collaborator as we've developed the public participation maturity model, and Canada's intending to launch a pilot of this work. Can you tell us more about why the launch of that pilot is important to you and to Canada's Open Government Program, and what you hope to achieve through that?
Yeah, certainly part of the story is somewhat outlined in the document itself, where I think the OECD scan of Canada kind of looked at certain key principles: transparency, accountability, and public participation. And Canada tends to do well, I would say, in terms of transparency and accountability, noting that that could always be improved, and there's certainly things that we're doing to improve it. But in terms of public participation and engagement, that was seen as a gap in that report. Not that it never occurs, but that there was projects and particular initiatives that may have had some public engagement at various levels, but it certainly wasn't system-wide. And in terms of having the guidance to support consistency in practice, that's something that was lacking in terms of looking at what does good public engagement look like and how do I improve public engagement. So the trust and transparency strategy that was launched in 2024 was meant to look at some of those core pillars: transparency, accountability, and public participation. And one of the commitments that we made was to enable government institutions to assess their current practices. So that's where the concept of a maturity model becomes very important to that process, because you need a way to benchmark your practices in order to improve on them. As I noted in my previous intervention, I think the standard is just that passive form of public engagement, whereas I think there are pockets within government that demonstrate a much more proactive, and they experiment with different approaches. I know Heritage Canada had Citizens Assembly, which was, or funded a Citizens Assembly, which was very well received. However, there are elements of that that in terms of the transparency and the accountability for how that input ultimately affected decision making. And I think it's that idea of looking at the interconnections between transparency, accountability, and public engagement, and then enabling that within organizations, and tools such as the maturity model are fundamental to that. And they also point to, and I'm glad the point was made earlier in terms of that when you're looking at public engagement, it's not something where you seek the gold standard immediately, because if you never engaged with stakeholders before and you go out and that's your first interaction, that might not be well received. So you need to build up to these types of things, and seeing those levels does help to understand the ecosystem a little bit better.
Wonderful. And I do want to acknowledge the many champions that we connect with within the Government of Canada who are passionate about this work. So thank you for being one of them, Charles. Aftab, if I can come to you next. You have a really fascinating experience, having worked as part of the City of Vancouver as the Chief Equity Officer and really been responsible for trying to push forward huge organizational changes as far as practices and how people think about their work. What from that experience have you learned about what works to drive organizational change and perhaps what doesn't work?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say on this is just to point out that probably within the maturity model, if we were going to place municipalities in Canada, at least vis-a-vis the provincial and federal government, we might say that municipalities are more mature in terms of having requirements, codified requirements for some forms of public engagement. Now, the bar is quite low. It's like public hearings, and I'm just remembering my land use law course where we learned that the requirement legally is that decision makers hear the public, not that they listen to the public, but that they hear the public. That's why it's called a public hearing. But there is at least some kind of bar, and some staffing sometimes, so that there is a little bit more capacity, and it's really not adequate for the level of complexity of what we are working with at the municipal level. And really, City Hall being the most accessible form of government in terms of people just walking in and asking to talk with the mayor. So yeah, I think there's a long ways to go at the municipal level. My experience, and so City of Vancouver, in some ways unusual. It's a big municipality. There's about 10,000 people if you count the police and the fire department and libraries and everybody in total. And so it was, I think, one of the slides, Nicole, you were talking about at the higher levels of maturity, if you will. There's the kind of engaging with the public, but they're also engaging internally within the organizations. And if one is not happening, the other can't be happening fully. And so what I think was somewhat successful in what I tried to do in my time there was to try to get as much internal engagement as possible in shifting the culture to one where we are not just following the code, but we are kind of trying to push into more innovative and more proactive areas of engagement. I do feel broadly that, culture eats planning for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, like everything. Like culture actually is the answer to how we shift this. And so, for those of us who are in the public participation realm, we know that you build culture through engagement. So, the same tools that we would use out there, we can be using within the workplaces that we are working in. And I think the more accessible, inclusive, fun those venues are, the more likely it is that we can have some success.
I see a whole bunch of emoji reactions to that idea of culture eats organizational practices for breakfast. So wonderful. And Tim, maybe we can ask you to come in. You wrote a blog earlier this year that for me was really useful as far as identifying the different levers for change. I think you identified 7 different levers for change in driving forward organizational transformation. Are you able to share some of that thinking with us?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And maybe just to quickly explain, kind of, I guess, where those 7 levers came from. So I guess it very much wasn't a thought exercise on my part. It was looking across our membership. So OGP has 74 national governments, including Canada, about 150 local governments, and for the past few years now, we've been working on looking at kind of, I guess, how we can support our different members to mainstream participation into policy making, into government decision making more. So this was a bit of an exercise of seeing what's already being done by our members, and that they kind of clustered into these 7 different areas. So the first actually, I think, speaks to the point that Aftab just made around introducing new or enhanced rights and requirements for participation. So whether those be laws requiring public involvement in certain decisions. So We've seen countries like Croatia recently introducing amendments to the rules of procedure. So any new draft law has to go through a public consultation process, but also when the law is presented to Parliament, it has to be presented along with the outcomes of the consultation. The second approach, like a set of approaches we've seen very much complementary, are around developing frameworks, minimum standards, and guidance for the conduct of public participation. So similar actually to the work that you've done with the maturity model, but we've seen countries like Italy recently co-creating their own national guidelines on participation. Then thirdly, there are countries that are institutionalizing specific methods or mechanisms for participation. So Finland is one example with their national dialogues that they've been working on over a number of years now on different topics. The fourth approach we've seen is around establishing participation teams or centres of good practice or independent participation bodies. So these are kind of institutions within government or kind of on the periphery of government with the skills and expertise around public participation. So France is a good example where they have a interdepartmental centre for public participation, which works across government to support and kind of upskill the rest of government around participation. Then we've also seen, I think, kind of related as well to that one, some countries setting up dedicated budgets and resources to support public participation processes. So the UK, for a number of years now, has had a government programme called ScienceWise, which, as part of what it does, it co-funds public dialogues on new and emerging science and technology issues with other parts of government. Then getting on to number 6, we've seen some governments also looking at how they can promote institutional culture of openness and collaboration. So the Netherlands is an interesting example where they're trying to professionalise participation by establishing a knowledge network of different participation practitioners across government. And then finally, I think one of the most interesting approaches we're seeing as well is some governments looking at how they can remove systemic and structural barriers to public participation. So the government of France, again, is looking at designating a system participant status, which would give some special, I guess, status to people who participate, particularly in deliberative forms of participation, which can ensure that they are kind of properly recognised for their involvement. So, so those are the 7, and again, they're also like your maturity model. We're looking to develop them over time as well as we see new approaches emerge. So, if anybody has seen alternative approaches, do let us know, and we'll kind of add them in.
Thank you, Tim. And we've just posted the link to your blog outlining those approaches in the chat, so folks can check them out and give you feedback. One thought that occurs to me is that all these different approaches are so interrelated. So even if culture eats practices for breakfast, I know I hear all the time champions asking for policy cover so that they can go out and do the right thing without getting in trouble, or people being inspired by seeing a demonstration project that then allows them to change their thinking about what's possible. So the interconnection between all these different methods is really an interesting one. Okay, a couple thoughts here. The first is that I just want to encourage folks, if you haven't already, and you've got a burning question, please put it in the question and answer button, and we'll be getting to that in about 5 or 10 minutes. So we'll start to harvest your questions. So you'll see there's a little box called Q&A with a question mark in it at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you can log your questions. What I'll ask for now is, if each of you were to put yourself in the shoes of a government that was looking to implement the maturity model, what advice would you give to those folks who are embarking on this journey? And let's start, we'll take a slightly different order this time. Tim, if you could start off.
So I think my advice comes back to something Nicole said and also something that Charles picked up on earlier, this kind of sense of just starting somewhere and not necessarily, I think it's great that you've developed this as a maturity model and seeing this as kind of stages of evolution that you can go through as a government or as kind of a public administration. And I think it's really important to not get too kind of overwhelmed by by, I guess, necessarily something needing to be the kind of the super kind of A-class standard straight away, but actually over time kind of building towards it. And I think it's that kind of practice and that kind of muscle memory that we need to build up, and over time that also builds the culture as well, I think. So kind of starting it, modeling it, showing that it works in your context, bringing other people on board with that, and then kind of continuing to build it, evolve it from there, I think is really key.
Thanks, Tim. And we'll go around the circle now with Charles, and then it will be Aftab and then Nicole.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to a point I made earlier about building relationships. If you're in government, then you'll naturally build relationships with often subject matter experts that relate to your policy area. And it really is about expanding those relationships. So when you're thinking about public engagement, it really is if the relationships that you have with experts are beneficial to your work, then simply expanding that. And as I noted before, you don't have to shoot for the gold standard. And I think this is where this becomes very relevant in terms of the maturity model, is look at areas that do it slightly better than you and emulate that and reach out to them and ask them to share their approaches and how they approached the different stakeholders that they reached out within and what worked for them. So I think it's creating the dialogue across departments, and this is what we're hoping that the maturity model contributes. It's not only, and this is why I like the different that the model can be used at different levels of scope, not just whole of the organization, but you look at what you're doing and then what others are doing, and then you could do these kind of multiple assessments and just having that dialogue on how you could improve and build upon what's already there. And maybe they are at a different level of maturity, but at least there are practices that you could identify within your own organization and just use that as a model, and just start by building those relationships.
And Charles, as you say that, I'm also thinking about the nature of the maturity model as a developmental evaluation tool. We didn't create this because we wanted to play gotcha and tell people they were doing a bad job. We wanted to create this so that folks can have the tools they need to improve over time. So yeah, folks don't need to be perfect to start. That's the whole point. Aftab.
Yeah, I love that answer, and I do think it's the beginning and end of this is relationships. Another piece that I want to put in, and maybe by way of story, I did when I was at the City of Vancouver, we used a kind of maturity model around equity, diversity, and inclusion. We used the global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmarks, which have 15 different categories and 5 different levels, and it was like a very big exercise. And I did find that it was very helpful, that exercise of mapping where we are at without having to pretend we are any better than we are, or hide anything. I thought that was super helpful. I mean, the thing is that in governments, you have a lot of technical people, like you have so many finance people, you have a lot of engineers, you have a lot of sort of very sort of linear thinkers, and that logic is dominant. And a maturity model speaks very well to that logic of the kind of like, we're just going to put dots on the map of where we're at right now, and that's going to illuminate the next steps. Like that, it just kind of brings the temperature down, because this area is it's chaotic and it's political and it's difficult. And so anything that can bring the temperature down a little bit is super helpful. I do have maybe a question for Nicole, Robin, which I think is important for decision makers to take into account as they use these kinds of models. As I was looking at it, I was wondering if it is a kind of, you go from step 1 and leave it and go to step 2 and leave it and go to step 3? Or is it kind of accumulative? Like, is it a kind of nested doll sort of thing? Is it possible to skip the codify thing and go right into stage 4? Like, does it need to be a path this way, or could you jump through some hoops? And I think that would be important to clarify as people are going to try to use this.
Nicole, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, for sure. It is kind of like a nested doll. We ran out of space, honestly, as we were getting to level 3 and level 4. There were so many good practices, including things that appeared in the first 2 levels that we did still want to encourage. And so we're encouraging folks to see, level 3 is what is written in level 3, but also the things in the prior levels. And same with level 4, mapping back to level 3. So I do think, especially when you're comparing across different indicators along the maturity model, it's very likely like you might be like a level 4 for some of the indicators, even if you don't. For instance, sometimes it's individual staff skill or initiative or going the extra mile that allows something to exist at a level 4, even if they don't have maybe a public engagement strategy or guidelines in place in the organization. So I think there is some skipping around and some flexibility, and it's been designed that way. And I might actually just to add on that, my thoughts about how best to use this. One thing I really wanted to encourage that kind of builds on what all of you have said is, first of all, focusing on priority areas. There's so many different things that you can map, and I think going through the whole assessment tool can be a useful first start, but I think it's a big bite to try to tackle all the fronts at once. And so really trying to think project by project, where can we start to do a small lift in each project that would up the bar and set a new standard for ourselves, but also to think about doing the assessment as a team effort inside the organization. And I think this goes into building that culture internally and this general understanding internally of what public participation is, involving both folks who are organizing engagement projects on the ground, but also more senior level decision makers, for them to really understand what it takes internally for greater accountability and greater transparency around where the input goes. So I think it's a team effort. And I also think different people in an organization might have very different perspectives on where the organization's maturity level is in different indicators, depending on what they're seeing from their particular angle. So I really think that this is a really great conversation starter. I really encourage folks to do an individual assessment, but then bring those assessments together and think about, okay, why is there a difference between what you're seeing and what I'm seeing, and where is that gap, and where do we actually think we land within that?
Okay, thanks so much, Nicole. And now that takes us perfectly to the next segment of our program, which will be to respond to the questions from everybody who's been listening. And I see the first question. Oh, they're all jumping around now, of course, as people begin to add them. But one question that was listed from HP, voulez traduire en français? Yes, we are translating into French, and Nicole, I believe we have a French launch scheduled as well, or coming up in the future. Is that true? Are you able to share?
Yeah, we are potentially collaborating with the Institut du Nouveau Monde in Montreal to do a French launch webinar, possibly later this fall. I would imagine October, November. But for now, the tool is available in French and English on the website, and Spanish will be coming very shortly later this week.
Okay, great. And we have another question about evidence from an anonymous attendee. It says, oh, and there we go again, jumping around. Excuse me. You spoke a few times about impact and how levels 3 and 4 get better outcomes and impact. Do you have some evidence around that you can share that we could use to motivate our organizations and leaders to move in that direction? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I might not have evidence offhand, but I can certainly speak to the engagement processes that I've been involved with, and I think when you take the time to actually go through some engagement processes that are beyond just passive engagement, where there is something that ties in the information that you use and the information you provide, and then circle back on the transparency side of things, people at least feel heard. And that's something that in some of the processes that I've been involved with in the past that has been communicated, where people didn't necessarily agree with the outcome or the decision that was made, but at least there was an acknowledgement in terms of reaching out, talking through it, explaining why certain decisions are being made. And I think it's also important, especially when you're dealing with government, and it does come back to electoral accountability in that because it's a relationship and a dialogue. When a government gets elected through democratic processes, they do feel that they have a mandate, and they do have a mandate from the population. So when you're engaging on that, I think that's an important consideration to look at where the government is coming from in terms of communicating its priorities and the things that they want to move forward. There's usually an indication as to the direction that the government is looking to go. So from a participant's perspective as well, I think that's an important thing to be kind of open to that aspect, and that ultimately that gets communicated, but at least you understand a bit of the context that they're in going into it. And I think it's part of that. There's responsibility, obviously, on government, but also in terms of participants to be open to the process that they go into.
I might also add that in terms of like harder evidence, there is, I would say the place where I'm seeing the most evidence coming is the field of deliberative democracy. So citizens' assemblies and innovations of that type are increasingly doing actually empirical studies where they look at the differences in effects on participants for different approaches to an assembly model, and you don't necessarily like a lot of that does transfer back to general public participation practices. You don't necessarily have to be going through a civic lottery in order to incorporate some good practices about how to inform participants well, how to report back well. Some of the evidence is really anecdotal. But we are trying to capture more and more of that in the resources that we are producing here at the center, so that we can give folks, I'll add in the chat, for example, we have a recent discussion starter on different ways to report back from an assembly process, which again can be used across the board for different forms of engagement. And it uses real life examples and case studies that show how that can look and what impact it might have.
I just maybe just very quickly to put a pin, and Nicole already had this in the presentation, but the OECD research on trust going up, the more engagement you have, I think is really key, and is one for those of us who still live in democracies. I mean, that is a convincing argument for decision makers. So in absence of more full research or research that's still coming, I would highlight that one.
Tim, is there anything else in the comparative work that you do across countries?
So, I mean, I think it's always challenging, kind of, I guess, fully evidencing the impact of participation, because often you're trying to, I guess it's what are you comparing it to? That's often the difficulty. And actually, one of the arguments that I often use, which is sometimes successful, is actually looking at where there hasn't been effective participation and actually looking at the cost of where there's not been participation. So particularly in policy failings, where actually if a bit of upstream engagement around a topic, you would have understood actually how the policy would have landed with the public, how the public would have interacted with the policy or the public service maybe in question, and actually would have saved a lot of money, a lot of effort from going down a wrong path. So I think that's something that's worth considering, as well as everything else that's been said.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe I'll just add as well that as I work with elected officials, sometimes I found, especially if I'm dealing with an older demographic, I ask elected officials to think about the week before they became a parent, and then the month after they became a parent for the first time. And for many folks, they have no way, or before they became parents, they had no understanding of what it meant like to be a parent. But then afterwards, they realized that there were all these things that they had never considered. And for me, that's a bit of a metaphor as far as the role that they play. Even if they're well-intentioned and empathetic, how could they make good decisions on somebody else's behalf when it's so difficult to understand somebody else's reality? So yeah, really interesting to think about the evidence and also the messages that are persuasive. The next question is from Paul Meyer, and I think this deals more with a stakeholder engagement context. But Paul's question is, in the context of a consultation between civil society and a government department, what would you advise as being the best way of dealing with an inadequate process being offered by the department? Civil society may feel it cannot press its objections to the process without risking the withdrawal of the department side. And in light of the fact that it was civil society which sought the consultation in the first place. So yeah, do the people who are engaged by government sometimes self-censor because they're afraid of ticking off the government that they're trying to influence? Maybe we can just have one or two answers to that. Anybody want to take that one?
I can come in quickly because I think this is, often an area that we are, I guess, we see through our own processes within OGP. Fundamental to OGP is this idea of co-creation and government, civil society working together. So I think there can certainly be a danger at times that civil society might self-censor a little bit, but I think also on the flip side, a danger that that governments kind of to some extent do the same as well. And I think there is where I've seen it work best is where you can develop that kind of open, honest relationship between government and civil society, and where actually the process itself can be governed by both sides, and there's kind of that openness and honesty in setting out the parameters of what's on the table, what's not on the table, what are the ground rules, kind of when, what is government prepared to in a sense kind of explore with civil society, but also from a civil society point of view, where the civil society say that if we can't address this issue, then we're going to kind of walk away from this process. And actually putting that on the table, having an open, honest conversation between government and civil society around those parameters, I think can be the basis of really then strong collaboration going forward.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And I see the questions are pouring in at the stage. So I'm going to read the next one, and then I'll also look down the list to try to see if there's some that I think would be of the most interest to the most people, because we may not be able to get through them all in the remaining 20 minutes. Maggie Tarbach says, thank you all for this webinar. What are some best practices for ensuring informed participation beyond providing fact sheets? It's such a challenge to build common understanding around community issues when folks have created their own truths. So a little shade of dealing with misinformation within there as well.
That's such.
Nicole?
Oh, Aftab, did you want to jump in?
For it.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to be rethinking the ways that we're providing information, especially in light of new challenges that we have with technology and AI and the amount of misinformation that is available, but also in terms of access. So some of the good practices that we recommend are, first of all, giving people information in advance, at least a week in advance, if not more, so that they have time to go through it. Thinking about really accessible multi-format things, whether that is incorporating video or plain language text or slides. Also seeing really great practices in terms of having more live kind of Q&A style forms of information delivery that bring in experts and allow people to both hear the information, but also be able to comment back and ask questions and get some clarification. And that includes diverse perspectives so that we can at least see and understand the roots of certain perspectives that might not be entirely grounded in evidence, but at least we can understand where certain myths or assumptions are coming from so that we can tackle those in our conversations. Also having ways that participants can ask for the information that they need. This works best when we are doing longer form engagement processes like assemblies, where we might be able to, have that kind of back and forth and make sure that folks have what they need to participate. But maybe Aftab has a few more things.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this, and then I'm going to go to the Bay Area resource generation question right after that. Which is to say, I mean, I think the fact that we are still, even like the idea of a fact sheet comes to mind is kind of interesting. I mean, like if you look at what is happening in schools, just in elementary schools, where we are trying to teach children things, you never will give them fact sheets. Like that is a completely outdated way of informing people. I think, the more hands-on the information, the more people can kind of play with it and question it and throw it back and forth. And like the more it is likely that they would learn something from it. I think part of the challenge that we're having right now, I mean, even besides the misinformation piece, it's like the complexity of what we are dealing with. And I think governments sometimes fall into believing that residents can't deal with complex information, so we won't give it to them. We'll just do fact sheets, we'll sort of package it in this. And I think that loses the richness of what could happen. And of course, if you do have a little bit of time and space and sort of like the luxury of explaining how the system works a little bit to residents, I think that goes a long ways in ensuring good participation. The next question was really about kind of fun forms of participation. What are some experimental participation models we've seen or worked on that might have worked well or not? I think I would just say, I mean, again, I think it's a continuation of what I was just saying, but hands-on participatory. I mean, the one process that Nicole and I recently were involved in, we gave out Monopoly money for people to do like a little participatory budget exercise on the spot. Another of the residents' assemblies I was involved in, we took people on a school bus to go to the neighborhoods and walk around and talk about, and just even getting on the school bus made it fun. I have a little tradition of, I have like a little red carpet in my office that if I have a significant engagement process that's happening, I lay out the red carpet, like just have a band, welcome people as they're coming, celebrate people as they're coming. It shouldn't be that going to participate in democracy is a chore and is dull, and the people are important. That's why we give them the red carpet. And so I would encourage all of that. Dressing up, I don't know. There's no reason this couldn't be more fun than it mostly is right now.
All right, I'll move on to the next question, and this is from Joanna. Joanna, perhaps, who used to work for the Open Government Program, I'm not sure. But the question is, with the rise of anti-democratic sentiment in North America and beyond, how do we institutionalize public participation to effect meaningful change? Contributing to government decision-making should be a right, not a privilege. Who makes sure that this right isn't ever taken away? Okay, so how do we think of public participation? Is it a right? Is it a privilege? And maybe this comes back to the earlier introductory question where we started to talk a little bit about the difference between elected officials and the accountability, the role they play, the different sorts of value that citizens bring. So what is this? Is it a right? Is it something else? And how does that roll up to developmental, or excuse me, democratic resilience?
Well, maybe I could just open things up. Obviously, there is fundamental rights to participate in democracy, which is the election process. I think what we're trying to instill is that beyond elections, that that part of that extends from elections themselves, and this is what I was getting at a bit before, where a government is elected on a particular mandate. The follow through on that mandate demands an ongoing dialogue. And how do you ensure that that citizens are part of that? There are pockets, like for example, the budget consultation process. It's not well known. It's there every year. You could go and fill out the survey. So I think part of it is having citizens themselves understand government, understand the cycles of government. Well, when governments are collecting ideas, that really does help in having more openness to different ideas, that there is this understanding of how government generally works. And that certainly is something where I think government institutions and people that launch consultations and engagement processes, they need to not assume that this information is well known. Something that I take for granted is not well known to the general public, and certainly my experience in discussing with my family and others, you realize to what degree people don't follow politics and even budget cycles or things like that. So it's really important that those fundamental things that kind of inform the relationship between citizen and government are well understood, and be open about it. I remember when I was working on the C27, where we had some stakeholders that when they saw the budget announcement, they'll be like, "Oh, you'll be tabling legislation within a few months," and we're like, that it's going to take a while. So we point them to the resources that outline typical timeframes so that they're informed and know what to expect and when to expect engagement as well.
Okay, thank you, Charles. And maybe I'll ask another question now that has to do with the federal government. And Jackie Dale is asking about, as we're aspiring to do this work, and I'm paraphrasing here, how do we make sure that this work is protected when there's budget cuts coming on the horizon? And she cites an example 15 years ago when the Office of Consumer and Public Involvement at Health Canada was apparently terminated or clawed back because of cuts. I know that this isn't for you to answer personally, Charles, but maybe we can ask the group, how do you communicate that this is work that isn't just overhead or isn't just making a project cycle take more time at a moment where government's proceeding with a sense of urgency to get things done? What is the message and the business case in that context?
Yeah, I think it's hard. Sorry, is it okay if I and probably the federal piece will need your voice for sure, Charles. I think just even the question of, is it a right, is it a privilege? I think participation is a strategic choice. It's a strategic choice that government makes in order to have a decision be more sustainable and more trustworthy and have more legs when it goes to implementation. So that's the way I would make the case for it. It's like, if we want a decision that actually the public then supports, we cannot make it in the back room and then bring it to the public. I do think the reality is we are going to have, this is unfortunately, these are departments that are going to be cut. And we have seen it, as the question suggests, throughout history. I don't think that there is any way to really protect against that, except, of course, running for office, which, we should do also. This is why I think that the culture eats, the culture also eats the department for breakfast, So if you have a culture of engagement that's distributed through the organization and doesn't just sit with the office that might be closed, it's much more sustainable. So I think the more we can actually spread it and not have a super specialized office, or have a specialized office that takes that expertise with some lightness and spreads it as much as possible, that's long-term the best strategy, I think.
And maybe obviously their budget constraints do play into maybe the level of ambition of your public engagement, or how you organize your public engagement. But I do think if you look at any policy development process, there's no process that's going to recommend sit behind your desk, draft the policy, and then recommend it to a decision maker. This is standard practice to openly engage on policy options and policy approaches. So it's not like something that is unusual to do. The opposite is unusual. When you're developing new policy, that is the expected approach, even at at very senior levels and internally. Like when we brief our ministers or senior levels, they'll ask, well, like, what did this group say, or what did these individuals say? It's because people are genuinely interested in knowing or being able to expect how a policy is going to land in the public. And that's why you have communications groups within departments, because they have to be able to anticipate what are the areas that are going to be sore points. And the only way to do that is by engaging with individuals that are most impacted, and then anticipate how certain issues are going to play out. So I think that's where I like the different, there's different approaches you could take that have to be commensurate to the resources you have. You're not always going to have experts. You're not always going to have a big budget to do engagement, but you have to look at what's possible within the resources you have to be able to produce sound policy. That's just a reality of policy development.
Okay, thank you both. And we'll move from the federal government now to local government. We've got a series of questions all about local governments. First of all, Casey just has an observation that many local governments here in BC seem to be overwhelmed by trying to adapt public participation or adopt it. And also an observation that the terms of elected officials create limited time to be able to engage with the public and get things done. And how does that factor in? And maybe I'll just pair that with a comment by Maureen, who's a resident who's been attending council meetings for 13 years. And Maureen notices that there's usually only 2 weeks turnaround time between when something is released and when it's discussed in front of council, and finds that really challenging as far as being able to turn around a community response or feedback on something when there's such little time to respond. And I think some local governments may have even less turnaround time than that as far as when council packages are released before a meeting. Does anybody want to talk about sort of structural limitations in local government and how public participation can fit within those?
Yeah, this is such, the timing is such a hard one. I mean, so the 2-week notice that you're getting, that is what's legislated. So that's kind of for public hearings for sure, and on development applications, 2 weeks is what's in the legislation. I will say it creates lots of problems. I mean, you know, the one that we ran into at the city of Vancouver was at one point we started thinking about council meetings that needed sign language or some other form of translation, and that was actually critical to them. And that takes like a month to organize. You know, it's not a thing where you just pick up the phone and the next day the person shows up and does simultaneous translation for you. Like, you actually need to plan that in advance. So the 2 weeks sometimes wouldn't give us, by the time people signed up to speak and we knew what was needed, we actually couldn't even accommodate what we wanted to accommodate and what was actually our responsibility to accommodate. So longer timelines would definitely help in terms of making processes more equitable. I think in actual fact, some of what you see is the volume of things coming before city councils at the local level. I mean, it's just first of all, there's no rhyme and reason to it. It's kind of like there's periods when there's so many, and I think local officials really struggle to deal with the volume of it. And so in a way, and many of them are emerging. It's like a lot of emergencies, a lot of changes that are happening on the spot. A public hearing that was supposed to go for a day that goes for 3 days. Everything changes in terms of the schedule, and so I think it's pretty difficult to make this clean, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. I think the longer periods would really help, and there's some kind of balance between that and both the need for responsiveness and just being able to deal with the volume of what's coming before council. Very difficult situation. And again, if there are folks here who are willing to run, maybe you have some more insight from that side of the table about how to work with this better.
Okay, I'll push us to the next question because time is scarce. We have a question from Nicole, and she's saying that from an equity lens, she likes to try to collect data about participants to understand who's present and who isn't, but that there's often pushback internally within government and externally from participants in giving or collecting that type of data about people's identities and demographics. How do you best find that balance? And where does that reticence come from?
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking that. And it's something that I've toyed with a lot when we've included that aspect of, monitoring participation in a higher level of equitable practice, because there is, of course, a lot of histories of data misuse. And also of, sometimes being able to say, well, we've consulted, X number of participants for this community, and therefore we've checked that box, and we know that there's never going to be a certain number that meets that threshold, right? You can only get a small percentage of the voice. But I do think a couple of things here. One is to give people really, first of all, choice in whether or not they give information through registration processes. I don't think it should be mandatory, but I think if we do explain to people, we are trying to make sure we're trying to, understand who is in the room. Could you give us a little bit of information so that we can then reach out? I think it's also, when we're talking about this monitoring aspect, I was trying to summarize this very briefly in the maturity model, but really what I think is necessary to address that gap is either to actually have a plan in place and the resources in order to expand engagement if you realize we really haven't heard from this community enough. That's not always possible. So I think the other alternative is to be able to acknowledge that in the way that you analyze and report back on the data. If you know that you haven't heard sufficiently from a particular group, or if in the room you heard people say, well, so-and-so is not here, and so these are the gaps that we're noticing as participants, being able to actually, have the skills internally in terms of the data analysis to be able to acknowledge that and to identify what might be missing from a policy and analysis perspective to further fill that in. And maybe that means further consultation down the road. Maybe that means more research down the road. Maybe that just means saying that out loud. But I do think, in terms of just the demographic data collection, I think it should be optional how much people want to share.
Thanks, Nicole. I'll also just acknowledge a question from Melissa around what elements of the maturity model are applicable to governments that operate in unstable institutional contexts, and she gives Global South as an example. Maybe I'll just add very quickly, because we're scarce on time, that I don't think there's any intention for us to say that this maturity model is universal. It was co-developed within Canada. There might be useful elements to it that others can draw from, and it's been released open source so that others are welcome to adapt it to their own context or to build their own if there's things that are useful to them. And with that, in the last 2 minutes, maybe I'll ask each of you just to take 30 seconds and give your final thoughts or a final point you want to emphasize. Nicole, do you want to go first? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. 30 seconds was a lot of pressure, but just to say that this is an ongoing conversation in our office, and I'm going to be putting in the link in the chat for Dialogue Dispatch, which is our dedicated newsletter for colleagues who are interested in this kind of work and want to continue to follow along with resources that we create in the next steps.
Charles.
Yeah, maybe I would just say, as I noted previously, I think the maturity model provides a great opportunity to open up the discussion within your own organizations. It's easy to point to something and raise it within that context, as opposed to just trying to raise it without having that context. And I think it opens up a good discussion in terms of practices within your organization, and to have that dialogue, because I do think that having the dialogue will lead to adoption.
Tim.
I do want to say congratulations and thank you for producing it, because although, as you say, it was developed for the Canadian context, I do think a lot in it has wider resonance as well. And really, I think there is, I think one of the challenges we have is that we've collectively, those focused around participation spend so much of our time thinking around how we plan the perfect participatory process often, but spend comparatively less time thinking about how we develop the I guess the context and the enabling environments for within our institutions for participation to be effective. And I think this really zeroes in on some of those key aspects. So yeah, great that you've kind of focused on those kind of institutional design questions as well, and culture.
Okay, Aftab, bring us home.
Awesome. Well, maybe I'll just actually echo Tim in thanking my team, Robin and Nicole and everybody. This is such an exciting moment to be in. I think to Charles' point, this is an important tool in what is actually the long game. You know, making democracy better is a long-term kind of project. There's going to be lots of up and downs. In some of your jurisdictions, it's hard right now. In some other places, that the doors are open. But I think these kind of broad tools that we can use to move the conversation forward, even in the background, even when it goes slow. I mean, I think we just have to keep going. And so I'm so happy that we can put this into the world and be in conversation with so many of you. Thank you.
And a big thank you to that community who joined us and who are working on this this type of issue as well. We learned so much from the community that works on public participation in creating the maturity model. And this is work that we all do together, and we all stand on the shoulders of giants. So thank you to everybody, and have a good rest of your day.